They say I brought more children into this world than any free doctor in Georgia, white or black. But don't let that fool you into thinking I had freedom. I was born in bondage, raised under the whip, and still, when babies came early or wrong, when mothers bled and screamed, they came running for me. Midwife, witch, angel, devil. I was called them all, but what no one ever called me was free. My name is Celia Washington, and this is the story of how I, an enslaved woman, with nothing to my name but calloused hands and quiet rage, used my skills, my mind, and a mother's love to rewrite fate itself, because one day I didn't just deliver a child, I traded lives. And if you stay with me, I'll tell you how a baby born to a slave became a master's son, and how that lie became my only shot at justice. I was known across 3 counties. When a baby wouldn't turn, when a mother's breath came shallow, when prayers stopped working, they called for Celia. I'd walk from cabin to cabin, sometimes into the grand halls of the big house, herbs in my pouch, fire in my spine. I'd clean blood with one hand and hold back death with the other. And for a moment, just a moment, people forgot I was property. I remember one birth, hot July day. A white planter's wife had been in labor for 2 days. Her face pale, hair matted, sheet soaked. 3 doctors stood around useless. Then the master sent for me. "Bring the black midwife," he barked. Not by my name, never by my name. I came in silent, placed a hand on her belly. Knew the baby was breech. They argued, I ignored, reached in, turned the child. 1 hour later, a boy was crying. The doctors gone. The husband didn't thank me. He didn't even look at me, just handed me back to the driver like a borrowed tool. But the mother squeezed my hand. She whispered, "Thank you, Celia." That whisper stayed with me longer than any whip scar. What most folks didn't know was that I learned my trade not from books, but from my mother, Dinah. She was a healer too, though they called her a witch. Half Choctaw, half African, she knew roots that made you sleep and roots that made you confess. She died when I was 15. After an overseer crushed her ribs, they said she fell. I buried her with my own hands, herbs still tucked in her apron. That night, I sat outside the quarters with my back against a tree and whispered a vow. I will learn every secret you knew, Mama. I will keep it safe. I will survive, and I did. Lord knows I did more than survive. As I grew older, I became indispensable. The mistress would call for me when she felt faint. The field hands trusted me with their babies before their own kin. The master let me into rooms no other enslaved woman could enter. He thought it was because I was harmless, quiet, loyal. He was wrong. I watched, I listened. I learned every door that creaked, every window that stuck, every guard who dozed after supper. Knowledge is a dangerous thing for someone like me, but I held it tight. And then one day everything changed. The mistress, young, delicate, and desperate for an heir, called for me with trembling hand. "Celia, I think I'm with child." And just like that, I was at the center of a storm. Now let me pause here and ask you something. If you had nothing, no papers, no money, no name that meant a thing outside your chain, and suddenly you saw a chance to take something back, would you? If you saw a way to give your child a life beyond cotton fields and lashes, a way to make the world call him sir instead of boy, would you take it? I didn't plan it then. Not yet, but the seed was planted, because at that same moment, I knew I was pregnant too, and the mistress and I, we were due the same week. That night I sat beneath the stars, rubbing my belly in secret. I thought of all the babies I had helped bring into the world, most of them to suffer. Some were torn from their mothers before their first teeth. Others whipped for crying too loud, but mine would never know chains. If I had to lie, if I had to bleed, if I had to swap fate itself, I would do it. For my baby, I would risk everything. You're just getting the beginning of this story. It ain't clean, it ain't simple, but it's mine. If you're still here, keep listening. The storm's only just begun. The master's house stood tall. White columns, red bricks, and polished floors so clean you could eat off them, a monument to Southern pride. But pride can't clean what's rotting underneath, and I knew every crack in those walls. By day I moved through that house like a ghost, wringing towels, brewing teas, tending to the mistress. But by night, when the doors closed and the candles dimmed, I became something else entirely. A watcher, an observer, a mother planning a future no one could predict. The mistress's belly grew soft and round. She swelled with the weight of an heir the master had prayed for, and I tended to her with hands steady as steel. She was only 17, barely a woman herself, married off to a man twice her age, just to unite 2 plantations. I pitied her, in the way you might pity a bird trapped in a cage made of gold. But I never forgot. She was still mistress, and I was still property. Meanwhile, in the slave quarters, I kept my pregnancy a secret. Only one person knew: Rachel. Rachel had been my closest friend since we were girls. We shared scraps of bread, whispered dreams under the floorboards, and cried over the same whippings. When I told her I was expecting, she touched my belly and said, "Then we pray your child comes out free, or not at all." It was Rachel who first said it out loud. What if the babies got switched? The idea struck me like lightning. Let me tell you something true. The closer a woman gets to labor, the more her spirit opens up like a wound. She becomes vulnerable, not just in body, but in soul. You can feel everything she feels. Her fear becomes yours. Her pain bleeds into your palms. I delivered dozens of babies, but I'd never imagined delivering two, one from freedom and one from chains, and trading them like seeds in the soil. But it started making sense. The mistress would never question the baby I gave her. She didn't know what to look for. She'd never seen a black newborn up close. All babies come out red and wrinkled, crying and blind. Who would question it in the chaos of birth? And mine, my boy, he'd be wrapped in silk sheets, fed warm milk, taught letters before he could walk. Hers? Well, hers would still be alive. I told myself that mattered. As the days turned into months, I made preparations. I kept both pregnancies on the same calendar. I measured the moon cycles. I collected herbs that could delay or hasten labor. I mapped out every second of the plan. I needed help more than Rachel. That's when I turned to Benji, the carpenter. Benji was a quiet man, eyes like worn wood, hands that could build anything from a cradle to a coffin. He'd lost 2 children to the auction block. He never smiled, but he listened. I told him what I was planning. He didn't flinch. Instead, he nodded and said, "You'll need someone to slip your baby out of the quarters unseen. I know a path," and just like that, the plan was in motion. The house staff became my unknowing accomplices. The butler too old to see clearly, the cook too deaf to hear whispers, the maid too scared to speak if she did. I moved like wind between rooms, watching, preparing, measuring how long it took to boil water, how far sound carried in the birthing room, when the master usually retired for the night. The final piece fell into place 2 weeks before the expected due date. The mistress complained of sharp pains. Labor had begun, so had mine, but I knew mine wasn't ready. I drank the bitterest brew I had, a root mama called bloodwort. It tore through me like fire, but it worked. 12 hours later, I was bent over in Rachel's cabin screaming into a cloth, while the mistress screamed upstairs in satin sheets. 2 babies, 2 lives, born minutes apart, one into silk, one into shackles. I held my son to my chest, trembling not from pain, but from the weight of what came next. Rachel wrapped him in clean cloth. "Are you sure?" I nodded. Upstairs, the mistress lay unconscious, exhausted and bleeding. The room stank of afterbirth and perfume. I whispered to Benji outside the window. He passed me the bundle. My child, my blood, swaddled tight, already asleep. I looked at the baby the mistress had birthed, smaller, weaker, pale. Then I made the switch, wrapped her child in slave's cloth, wrapped mine in lace, and laid him in the mistress's arms. No one knew, not the master, drunk and celebrating downstairs, not the wet nurse, summoned to feed what she thought was her mistress's child, not the girl whose baby now slept in a cabin, destined to grow in the dirt. Only 3 of us knew the truth, me, Rachel, and Benji. We carried that truth like a flame in a bottle, hidden, but always burning. I didn't sleep for 3 nights. I lay with my ears sharp for footsteps, for questions, for anything that could unravel it all. But silence can be its own sound. And in that silence I realized I had just rewritten history. But the danger was just beginning. He was named Nathaniel Carter, the master's full name, passed down like land and silver. They called him Little Nate. They said he had his father's eyes and his mother's smile. But I knew the truth. He had my hands, those long fingers, my father's gift, that crease in his chin. My brother had the same one before he was sold to Mississippi. Little Nate was my son, and every day I watched him grow under a roof that would have never been his, if not for a lie as sharp as any blade. In the beginning I stayed close. I was the cook again, always nearby. When he cried, I was there with a warm cloth. When he stumbled, I was there with a firm hand. The mistress doted on him, but she was too young to know what a child needed, too broken by her husband's cruelty to give anything more than affection. The master, he ignored him, unless there were guests. Then he paraded the boy around like a prized colt. Look at my boy, strong already, born to lead. Every word made my stomach twist. Because if he ever found out, down in the quarters, the other baby, Samuel we called him, was given to a barren woman named Esther, kind, gentle. She'd lost her last child to fever. She never asked questions. She just held him close and said, "He's quiet, like he knows things." And maybe he did. Maybe both boys did. One raised in silk, one raised in soil, and yet neither where they belonged. Benji made a small wooden horse for Nathaniel's second birthday. Said it was a gift from a grateful carpenter. Nathaniel hugged it tight, refusing to let go. He slept with it for weeks. I cried that night, not because of joy, but because I feared that the closer he grew to them, the further he grew from me. The plantation changed after the births. Rachel warned me. Whispers are starting, Celia. Servants notice things. A birth too quiet. A baby too tan. One day the midwife came back, months after she had disappeared. She looked at Nathaniel long and hard. Too long. I followed her into the garden. Before she could speak, I handed her a pouch of coins, all I had saved for 3 years. She looked down at it, then back at me, and walked away without a word. Nathaniel began asking questions at 5. Why is my skin darker than Mama's? Why do some people call me mulatto? I told him stories, that his grandmother had Spanish blood, that the sun had kissed him a little harder, that God liked to make masterpieces in every shade. But I saw the cracks forming. And cracks let truth leak in. One evening, I was humming while cutting sweet potatoes. Nathaniel sat at the table, eyes sharp like a hawk's. You sound like the lullaby Mama Esther sings to Sammy. I froze. I never meant to sing that song. Not outside the quarters. Where did you hear it? I asked carefully. Sammy hums it. He says his real mama sang it too. The hair on my neck stood up. Sammy remembered. Esther must have sung it to him after hearing it from me, and now. It had come full circle, I realized then. No secret stays buried forever. Not in a house like this. Not with blood involved. I had to make a decision. Do I tell the truth and risk losing him? Or do I keep lying and risk losing myself? Nathaniel was growing fast. He hated math but loved stories. He asked questions about the stars. And once, when a white boy called one of the stable hands a monkey, Nathaniel punched him straight in the nose. The master whipped him for that. And I stood outside the door, biting down on my hand until it bled, just to keep from screaming. When it was over, Nathaniel came to the kitchen, silent and bleeding. I pressed a cool cloth to his back, whispering, "Don't you ever let them tell you who you are." He looked me in the eye and said, "Then tell me, Miss Celia, who am I?" I didn't have an answer. Not yet. Some nights I dreamed of running, taking both boys and disappearing into the woods, becoming a ghost family no one could trace. But reality always returned, and with it the truth. I had built a lie too big to carry, and it was starting to break my back. They say secrets protect you, but what they don't say is how much they cost. Every day I saw my son become a stranger, and every night I whispered a prayer that I'd done the right thing. But prayer can't fix what truth might destroy, and soon the past would come knocking. You'd think a switch like that would go unnoticed, especially in a house bustling with wet nurses, servants, and the chaos of childbirth. But secrets like mine, they carry a scent. Maybe not to the average nose, but to those who were raised to be suspicious. To master types who believe ownership gives them intuition. Sometimes they catch a whiff. It didn't happen right away. For weeks, my heart beat hard in my chest every time someone looked at the baby. Every time the master's wife, Lillian, cooed over her precious Jeremiah, my stomach would twist. But no one said anything. Not the overseer, not the midwife who'd stepped out for water, not even the cook who saw both babies and blinked like she'd seen a ghost. She kept her mouth shut. Maybe for her own reasons. But around the 4th month, something changed. I noticed the master, Mr. Ashby, lingering more. He wasn't a man given to softness, but with his air he forced tenderness. He'd hold the baby just a moment longer than needed, studying him. He'd ask odd questions. He's paler than I expected, isn't he? Or did his eyes always look like that? Small things, but I saw the pattern forming, and it scared me more than anything else. That day, I remember I was washing linens when I heard him talking in the hallway outside the nursery. He wasn't loud, but his voice always carried that tension, like a wire pulled too tight. She swears he came early. That explains the wait, he muttered to his overseer, Carlton. But I swear, sometimes I look at him, and he looks nothing like me. I froze. The sheet slipped from my hands, soaking in the wash basin. My ears burned. The baby they were talking about was my baby, and he was already under a microscope. Carlton, Always the agreeable snake, just nodded. You know how they change, sir. Babies always look strange in the first year. But Mr. Ashby wasn't convinced, and I knew men like him didn't stop once they started sniffing something wrong. From that day on, I began to live two lives. The first was the obedient midwife, never speaking unless spoken to, always busy with chores or herbs or tending to other children. The second was the mother in hiding, watching her real child grow up in satin, terrified every time someone noticed the shape of his nose or the kink in his hair after a bath. There was one evening that nearly undid it all. I had been summoned to prepare a tea infusion for Mrs. Ashby, something to ease her headaches. The pantry where the herbs were kept shared a wall with Mr. Ashby's study. And that wall, it was thin. I heard them arguing. She won't say it aloud, but I know she doubts it too, he said. Her mother visited last week and kept making faces. You saw her. She thinks the child doesn't look like our line. There was silence for a while, then papers rustling. I'm sending for a physician, he said finally. One from Savannah, discreet, will have the child examined. I nearly dropped the mortar and pestle. A physician? What kind of examination did he mean? The next morning I made sure to be in the nursery before anyone else. My baby, Jeremiah now as the world knew him, was lying there in fine linen, wrapped like a little prince. He smiled when he saw me. And Lord help me, I nearly cried. If the doctor was coming, I had little time. I needed to know what kind of test this was. Blood, birthmarks, something about lineage? I had no way of knowing, but I couldn't risk it, so I did what I'd learned best. I listened. I hovered near Carlton the next day while he smoked behind the barn. He liked to talk when he thought no one important was listening, and I was a shadow in that house, present but invisible. He said the doctor was coming in 3 days. Gonna check the boy's bones. Ask questions about birth timing, you know. Nothing too invasive. Just enough to settle the master's mind. 3 days, that's what I had. That night I didn't sleep. I held the small wooden charm my grandmother had given me before she passed. She called it a watcher's ward, meant to keep harm away from children. I pressed it against my lips and prayed, not in English, not in the hymns they made us sing, but in the old tongue, the one barely anyone remembered but me. And then I made my decision. If they found out, there'd be no forgiveness, no court, no second chance. I'd be hung, and my baby would be cast out or worse, so I needed to act first. I brewed a calming tea for Mrs. Ashby the next morning, one with valerian, camphor, and just enough extract to keep her drowsy for hours. The same night I swapped the babies again. Yes, again, only this time it wasn't for long. Just for one night, just long enough for the physician's visit. I made sure that Jeremiah looked a little flushed, enough for the doctor to decide he was too ill for any examinations. It worked. I saw it in his eyes when he left the room. He wasn't just suspicious, he was hunting the truth. And I realized hiding the truth once wasn't enough. Now, I had to protect it, at all costs. I always knew the day would come when truth would sneak its way into the manor, not with a roar, but a whisper. It came wrapped in lace, wine, and suspicion. Master Whitmore's wife, Eleanor, was a quiet woman, always watching, always calculating. She'd once lost a child, one she carried for 9 months only to bury within a day. Since then, she'd looked at Sarah with eyes that burned like ice, never saying a word, but always seeming to measure her against something unseen, something unspoken. That something I later understood was doubt. One morning, Eleanor ordered Sarah and Daniel to the drawing room. I knew something was wrong because she didn't call me to bring tea. And Eleanor never lifted her hand for anything she could make someone else do. I stood in the hallway pretending to sweep, my ear pressed to the molding as her voice carried through the crack of the door. I've arranged something for clarity. That's how she said it. Not accusation, not curiosity, just clarity. That was more dangerous. The man she brought was a doctor from New Orleans, one of those men who spoke in precise syllables, as though every word cost him money. He carried a small case and wore gloves he never took off. I didn't understand everything he said, but I heard one phrase clear as church bells. Blood compatibility testing. Sarah flinched. Daniel laughed. Nervous, the way boys do when they don't understand a threat. I knew better. I'd seen enough to know that tests aren't made to find truth. They're made to corner lies. Master Whitmore wasn't even in the house that day. He'd left for the city a few nights before and hadn't returned. That, more than anything, told me he was in on it. He didn't want to see it happen, only to hear the result. I waited in the corridor until the doctor left. He didn't look at me. Men like him never did. That night, I found Sarah in the old greenhouse behind the stables, where no one went since the last storm had shattered its glass roof. She was sitting on a broken bench, her hands clenched around a rusted gardening trowel. Her knuckles were white. "They pricked his finger," she whispered. "Said they needed a vial." I sat beside her. She didn't cry. Sarah had never been the kind to fall apart. Not since that first year they took her from the quarters and placed her in the house. She'd learned long ago how to hurt quietly. "Do you think they'll find out?" she asked. I didn't answer right away. Instead, I stared at the broken panes above us, how the moonlight spilled in crooked patches, like truth trying to slip through. Then I said, "If they don't already know, it won't matter. That test ain't for science, it's for control." She looked at me then, truly looked. "What do we do?" I shook my head. "Not yet. Let them speak first. Always let the wolves howl before you decide whether to run or strike." 2 days passed. No one said anything. Eleanor returned to her quiet watchfulness. The master came home. And then, at dinner on the third night, he dropped his fork. "He's got your eyes," he said to me. The table froze. Eleanor blinked once. Sarah went pale. I pretended not to hear. Reached for a plate, placed it in front of Daniel. I said he repeated, "He's got your eyes." That's when I looked at him. Looked through him. Let the silence wrap around the table like a noose. "My eyes," I said softly. "No, sir, just the light playing tricks, but we both knew." And then he laughed, loud, jagged. "Tricks, yes, this whole house is full of them." I could feel Sarah shaking beside me. I placed my hand on her knee under the table. Stillness was survival. He didn't say another word about it that night, but the next morning the doctor returned. This time he asked for my blood. I didn't hesitate. I held out my arm, steady as stone. He pricked my vein, filled the vial, and left without a word. That evening I found the test results burned in the fireplace, just ashes and glass. I knew then the truth had arrived, and it was unwanted. Later that week, Master Whitmore handed me a small pouch, coins inside. He said nothing, just pressed it into my hand as he passed me in the hallway. A payment? A bribe? A warning didn't matter. I threw it into the creek that night. What did matter was Daniel. He had started looking at me differently, not with fear or confusion, but curiosity. Like he saw something reflected in me he hadn't noticed before. I saw it too, in his stride, in the way he'd pick up a hammer and hold it like it was born to his grip. He was mine. I had known it from the moment he first gripped my finger in that quiet room, the day of his birth. And now, so did they. But truth, when buried, doesn't die. It festers. I knew what came next wouldn't be peace. It would be silence, tightly wound around secrets too dangerous to speak aloud. And so I made a decision. If they were going to treat Daniel like a bastard of the quarters, then I would teach him to rise like a son of kings. And if that meant burning the past to ash, so be it. Because blood may bind, but it also burns. I don't remember the exact moment the idea was born. It wasn't a thunderclap. It was more like a slow drip. A drop of realization, then another, until a quiet resolve filled me completely. Sarah and I never said it aloud, not even once. But the silence between us held a pact more binding than any spoken promise. Thomas had grown, tall like his father, but he moved with a caution that wasn't natural for a child. He flinched when the master raised his voice, even if it wasn't aimed at him. I'd catch him staring at his own reflection sometimes, confused, as if his face didn't belong to him. And when he asked why his skin was lighter than mine, why he didn't look like David or the other children, I lied. I told him it was from the sun, from his grandmother's side, from anything but the truth. But lies are heavy, and truth, it presses harder the longer it's buried. One morning, after the frost had melted into mud, and the air hinted at spring, Sarah sent for me. Her eyes were puffy, her hands shaking. She'd heard whispers, rumors from the big house. The master's wife had grown cold, distant. Servants whispered about her suspicions. Someone had noticed Thomas's resemblance. Someone had run their mouth. It wasn't just gossip anymore. It was danger. That night we sat in the corner of the cookhouse, the fire barely flickering. Sarah braided her hair slowly, deliberately, the way she did when she needed to think. I sat beside her, knees pulled up, arms wrapped around them like a shield. She didn't say we have to act, as she didn't have to. Instead, she said, "He won't let this boy live if he thinks the truth." And I said, then he won't know the truth. That was it. The plan wasn't complex. It was a matter of small changes. Gentle redirection, a nudge here, a silence there. I taught Thomas to look down when spoken to nod instead of speak, to walk the long way around the master's line of sight. Sarah adjusted his chores. kept him closer to the fields farther from the house. The other children were told nothing, but they sensed something had shifted. Their teasing stopped. Their eyes softened, and the master, he grew watchful. He'd never paid much attention to Thomas before. Why would he? But now his glances lingered. He'd squint, as if trying to recall something he never wanted to admit. He questioned Thomas's mother, called her in for private talks. She always came back pale, trembling but quiet. One afternoon, I found Thomas hiding in the smokehouse, clutching a piece of cloth from the master's study, a discarded handkerchief. His face was blank, but his hands trembled. I knelt beside him, took the cloth gently and said, "Don't ever take what ain't yours again, even if it feels like it is." He nodded, but I saw the confusion still behind his eyes, the question he didn't yet know how to ask. The tension built like summer heat, thick and restless. Until one day, the master called me to the barn, just me. He was standing by the door, arms crossed. His face was unreadable, like stone worn by years. "You ever notice how much that boy looks like someone?" he asked. I felt my heart pause. "Like who?" I answered, keeping my voice even. He studied me, but I didn't flinch. I couldn't. He didn't say anything more, just turned and walked out. That was the warning. No threats, just the air shifting, the storm gathering. I went to Sarah that night. She was sitting on her bed, Thomas asleep beside her. "It's getting close," I whispered. She nodded once, then we finish it. The next few weeks we made moves, subtle, quiet, decisive. We encouraged Thomas to learn skills that would be useful outside these grounds. Carpentry from old Ben, letters from Naomi when no one was looking. We made sure he wasn't noticed, even as we prepared him to leave one day, because we knew either he'd have to run or one of us wouldn't make it. Then one dusk, as the cicadas screamed and the fields glowed gold, the master's wife collapsed at supper. Word spread fast, a fever, they said, or heartbreak. She stopped speaking, barely ate, rarely left her room. The master grew wilder, less concerned with discipline, more with silence. He stopped asking about Thomas, and we stopped answering. In the quiet that followed, something strange happened. The overseers backed off. The lashes became fewer, the cruelty more sporadic. It was as if a spell had been cast, like our silence had become a shield. But I knew better. I knew it was just calm before a reckoning. One evening, Thomas sat beside me in the barn, legs swinging from the hayloft. "Pa," he whispered. I turned slowly. He had never called me that before, not aloud. He looked at me, and I saw he already knew. The truth wasn't a storm anymore. It was the stillness after. I nodded, just once, and that was our real pact. He didn't ask why I lied. I didn't ask how long he'd known. We just sat there, side by side, father and son, in the dark. We had bought him time. That was all we could do. But sometimes, time was enough to rewrite a destiny. And as the moon rose and bathed us in silver light, I whispered to him, "One day, you'll go far from here. But don't forget who you are. Not what they called you, who you really are." He didn't answer. He didn't need to. The pact was sealed in silence. I used to believe the hardest part of my secret was hiding it from the master. But I was wrong. The hardest part was hiding it from them, my boys. David and Elijah grew up side by side, like vines twisting around the same post. One white, one brown. One with privileges he didn't understand, the other with questions I couldn't answer. They shared everything: toys carved from peach wood, slices of cold corn cake, the same bed of straw in the kitchen quarters when Elijah snuck in after dark. They even shared a laugh that sounded just like their father's. But no matter how close they were, the world kept reminding them they were not the same. It started small. When they were 5 or 6, Mistress June would give David sweet biscuits while Elijah got cornbread. David was called young master while Elijah was just boy. At first, Elijah didn't notice. But children are sharper than we give them credit for. One day, I caught him staring at his reflection in a puddle beside David's. Same eyes, same nose, but a different shade. That's when the questions began. "Mama," Elijah whispered one night, "why don't I get to eat at the big table?" I froze. My heart clenched so tight I thought I might stop breathing. "Because that table don't make you full," I lied, brushing his hair from his forehead. "What we got makes us strong in different ways." "But why does David get to ride horses and go to school, and I don't?" he asked again. I looked into his wide eyes. My own son asking me why the world was built to crush him. I couldn't tell him the truth, not yet. So I told him another half-truth. "Because some folks don't understand what real strength looks like, baby. But you will." David, on the other hand, lived in a world that bent around him. The older he got, the more he was groomed to become his father's heir. He learned to read and write, wore fine wool coats, and was taught to shoot rifles and recite Latin. But he always snuck back to the kitchen to see Elijah, like nothing had changed. I watched from the shadows, torn between pride and dread. They were brothers in every way but name. When they were 10, something happened I'll never forget. Elijah had bruises on his arms and a split lip. "Who did this?" I asked, holding his chin gently. "One of the older boys," he muttered. "Said I was getting uppity, said I talked too white." David came in not long after, his own fists bloodied. "I hit him," he said. "He hit Elijah, so I hit him." The overseer whipped David that evening. I heard his cries from the main house while Elijah wept into my lap. "I wish I wasn't born," Elijah sobbed. "No," I said firmly, holding him tighter. "You were born for a reason." That night, I knew things couldn't go on like this forever. My sons were growing, and the lines between their worlds were hardening. The plantation would never accept their bond, and one day one would rise while the other would be crushed beneath him. I needed a plan, a real one. That's when I remembered Miss Letty, the midwife and root woman who'd helped me give birth. She knew the secrets of herbs and hearts. If anyone could help me untangle the knot I'd tied the day I switched them, it was her. I visited her under the guise of fetching medicine for Mistress June. "Letty," I said quietly, "I need a way to prove something." Without them knowing, she looked at me with her milky eyes, blind but seeing deeper than most. "You want to know which boy's blood sings the truth," she said. I nodded. She gave me a small pouch filled with dried roots and a bit of cloth. "Take a thread of each boy's hair," she whispered. "Burn it with this. The one whose smoke turns blue, he's your blood." That night I did as she said. My hands trembled as I held the burning strands. Elijah's smoke turned a deep, swirling blue. David's smoke drifted grey. It confirmed what my heart had known all along, but seeing it made the truth heavier. And now the burden was even greater. What would happen when the master died? David would inherit the land. Elijah would be left behind. What if David one day ordered a whipping without realizing he was punishing his own brother? I couldn't let that happen. I began to teach Elijah secretly. Letters carved into wood, numbers made from beans. He learned fast. Faster than David even. I saw a fire in him, one that needed direction. So I gave it to him little by little, every night after chores. David noticed. "Why doesn't Elijah get to go to school?" He asked one afternoon. "He's smarter than me." "Because the world ain't fair," I said simply. "And because you can help change that." He didn't understand then, but I planted the seed. As the boys grew older, the differences between them became harder to hide. Elijah's voice deepened first. He grew taller. Their faces looked almost like mirrors, but no one saw it, not even them. Still, the danger grew. One day, Master caught Elijah reading. "Where did you learn this?" he roared. I stepped forward before Elijah could answer. "I taught him," I said, heart-pounding. Master's eyes burned into me. "You've overstepped," he said coldly. "This is not your place." But he didn't punish me. Not yet, because David stepped in. "He reads better than me," he said. "He helps me study." That was the first time I realized David might already know the truth, or at least suspect it. From that moment on, I knew the time was coming when there would no longer be boys. The truth would not stay buried. And when it came to light, it would change everything. I just didn't know whether it would set them free or tear them apart. I always knew the old man would never leave quietly. Even in death, he wanted to keep control of his land, his name, and of us. But when the lawyer rode in that day, tie twisted tight around his thick red neck and dust clinging to his boots, I didn't expect the truth to come out in front of everyone. We were all there, on the porch, under that crooked roof that had seen too many storms. The master's pale wife looking stiff as ironwood, their son Walter Jr. sweating through his coat despite the... And then there was me, standing behind them, pretending I didn't hear a word, while my heart thudded like a drum in my chest. The lawyer cleared his throat and opened the will. To my son, Walter Jr., he read, "I leave the plantation house, the horses, and the remaining fields, of course." Then he paused. The wind picked up just a bit, enough to make the trees whisper. And to Thomas, my breath caught. The boy raised under my roof, taught my name, and whom I claim by blood. I leave the deed to the carpenter's shop, the quarter-acre behind it, and a stipend to build his own business. There was silence, heavy, painful silence. Mrs. Walter turned to stone. Walter Jr. turned red. And me. I froze in place. I didn't look at Thomas. I didn't blink. I didn't breathe. He'd done it. The old devil had admitted it, right there in legal ink. He'd told the world what I already knew in my bones. Thomas was his, born of me, but carrying his cursed blood too. Walter Jr. exploded. He's lying. That's not his son. The lawyer didn't flinch. It's signed, witnessed, filed. Mrs. Walter stood up, her voice sharper than a whip. This is blasphemy. You expect us to accept this charade? That woman's child? He is his child, I whispered. My voice must have sounded like a knife. They turned to look at me like I'd broken something sacred. I didn't ask for it, but he made it so. And now it's written in the law. I stepped forward slowly. Thomas stayed behind me, confused, scared. He didn't know the truth yet. Not all of it. But the white folks, they were livid. The illusion was broken. Later that evening, Thomas found me near the shed where I used to fix shoes and boil soap. He was shaking. Why did he give me that land, Mama? What does it mean? I took his hand. It means the world's gonna treat you different now. Some will say you don't deserve it. Others will want to take it. But you've got to stand straight, son. You've got to remember where you came from and who you really are. He looked at me, eyes full of questions I wasn't ready to answer. But time was running out. That night I stayed up with candle wax dripping slow. I read the will again and again. I memorized every word because I knew what would come next. Property be damned. Those people weren't gonna let peace settle on my boy's shoulders. The next week, Walter Jr. tried to block the transfer, said it was forged, said his father was sick when he wrote it, but it was no use. Every legal man who touched it said the same. It held up. So Walter tried something worse. He sent threats. Then sabotage. Thomas's tools went missing. The roof of his new shop mysteriously collapsed in the rain. A horse went wild one day and nearly crushed him. I knew where it all came from. I knew the fury of a man who thought the world owed him everything. One day, I found a dead crone nailed to our door, its wings spread out like a warning. I took it down, buried it myself, didn't say a word, because while Walter was busy with hate, we were building something real. Thomas started training other young men in carpentry. Boys who had no names, no skills, no future. He gave them one. Bit by bit, they shaped wood into hope. That quarter acre, it turned into a haven. No master, no overseer, just honest work, sweat, and dignity. People started coming from other towns to get furniture made by Thomas the Quiet. That's what they called him. He didn't talk much, but his hands spoke volumes. Every plank, every frame was built like it could survive 100 storms. Walter hated it, and still he came around, lurking, eyes sharp, waiting for Thomas to fail, but he didn't. One afternoon, Thomas approached me. He held the will in one hand, folded crisp. "Do you think he did it to make up for everything?" he asked. I thought hard, then shook my head. No, he did it because even a cruel man wants to be remembered as a good one. But it don't matter why. What matters is what you do with it. Thomas nodded. He didn't say another word. Just walked back to the shop, shoulders square. That was the moment I knew the past didn't own us anymore. We weren't just the sum of someone else's choices. We were writing our own name, plank by plank, breath by breath. And no piece of paper, no bloodline could undo that. I didn't sleep that night. The words burned into my skull like a hot brand. The boy is yours, Caleb, you know it. I hadn't known it. Not fully. Not until that moment. But Sarah's face, her trembling mouth, her tear-filled eyes, confirmed what my heart already feared. David, the child I'd helped raise, the one who smiled like me when he carved wood or whistled through his teeth when he lied. He was mine, my son. And now, he was theirs. Not just under their roof, not just fed from their plates, but held up as one of them, wearing fine clothes. Learning to read openly, sitting beside the master's own son as if they were equals. They looked like brothers because they were brothers, half-bloods, but only one of them bore the stain of slavery. The other was heir to a fortune. I walked through the fields that night, with nothing but the moon and the ache in my chest. The cotton rows stretched endlessly, but I saw only memories. Sarah's frightened eyes the night the overseer pulled her away, her silence for weeks afterward. The baby born with a full head of dark curls and a face too similar to mine. She had protected him, lied for him, lied to me, but I couldn't hate her. How could I? She was just surviving. Just trying to keep our child alive in a world where the truth was a death sentence. But now the truth was out. And I had no idea what it meant. The next morning, the master called for David to ride with him to town. Let him wear something fine, he told Sarah. The boy's got promise. Sharp tongue, good sense. I might have used for him in the office one day. Sarah didn't look at me, just handed the boy his coat and kissed his forehead. And when the two rode off, she collapsed in the kitchen, trembling. "They know," she whispered. "The master's sister, she's the one who guessed. Said David looked too much like you. Said, if it ever got out. Her words trailed off, but I understood. If it ever got out that David was mine, not the master's son, not their mixed blood legacy, but born of a woman they considered nothing, and a man they owned, then everything would fall apart. Their illusion of control, their story of grace and mercy. The inheritance, the image, the line, they'd never let that happen, and that meant David was in danger. I went to old Nora that night. She was the oldest among us, a woman who'd survived 3 masters and buried 2 of her own children. If anyone could read the winds of fate, it was her. She listened quietly as I told her everything. How the boy had grown, how the master treated him kindly, how his sister had grown suspicious, how I feared the truth would destroy him. Nora didn't speak for a long time, just stared into the flames of her hearth, her hands folded in her lap. Then she said something I didn't expect. Truth don't destroy, child. Lies do. I stared at her. She met my gaze with those clouded old eyes. Your boy don't know who he is, and you don't know who he might become if he did. But the ones who fear truth, they'll kill to keep it buried. You best be ready. The next days passed in tension so thick you could slice it with a blade. The master watched David differently now. Less kindly, more like he was measuring him. Sarah barely slept, and I started planning, not revenge, not yet, but protection. I began carving again. Late at night, after the house had gone quiet, I sat by the fire and worked wood with trembling hands. A small figure this time, sturdy with proud shoulders, strong jaw, and eyes that stared ahead unafraid. David. When it was finished, I wrapped it in cloth and placed it beneath the floorboards of our cabin. A promise. If I couldn't save him, if I couldn't tell him the truth, at least the truth would wait for him. But the truth didn't wait long. One evening, the master's sister confronted Sarah outside the kitchen. I watched from a distance, heart pounding. You think we don't see it, she hissed. You think we're blind. That child isn't Charles's, he's his. She pointed toward the fields, toward me. You brought shame into this house. You've cursed us. Sarah said nothing, just stood there trembling. You want to stay here, you fix it. That boy's too old to be coddled now. Send him to the fields, or send him away. That night, Sarah came to me, pale and broken. They're sending him to another plantation, she whispered. Tomorrow, they want him gone before the rumors grow. My fists clenched so tight my nails cut into my palms. They were stealing my son, not as an act of cruelty, but as a calculated move to protect their legacy. They would erase him, ship him off like a crate of sugar, pretend he never existed. But I wasn't going to let them. Not again. I'd already lost too much. That night I stayed awake by the window, watching David sleep. His face was peaceful, unaware of the storm about to tear him from everything he knew. And as I sat there, I made a vow. If they were going to bury the truth, then I would unearth it with fire. I had always been careful. Too careful, some would say. But after that night in the library, after the papers and promises, I knew my margin for error was gone. The plantation was a theater of smiles and secrets now. Martha watched every move I made. The other slaves gave me longer looks, wondering what I might be up to. Even the wind in the trees felt like it was whispering doubts into my ears. I had lit a fuse, and now I was waiting to see where the fire would reach. The master's health declined fast. His skin turned yellow, his voice raspier. He coughed like thunder through the walls of the house, and the doctor came more often, frowning deeper each time. Martha started sleeping in a separate room, and when the doctor wasn't around, she paced like a woman trying to solve a riddle only God could answer. What they didn't know, what nobody but me knew, was that the master wasn't just dying. He was being slowly undone, piece by piece, soul by soul, and not by any poison, but by the truth I'd folded into his favorite room, the one place he thought was his sanctuary, the library. I discovered something strange. The house had old plumbing under the floorboards, copper pipes once used to heat the rooms in winter. They no longer worked, but the space beneath the library remained dry, a hidden crawl space with just enough room to lie flat. I had begun slipping in there late at night with a candle and my own kind of fire. For weeks I whispered words my grandmother used to say, words in the old tongue buried deep under English. Words of memory, of pain, of ancestors long gone but never quiet. I brought things with me, soil from my mother's grave, hair clippings from the master's comb, torn pages from his account books. I wove these into small charms, binding the past to the present. Every chant I whispered beneath the floorboards echoed up through the wooden panels and into the air he breathed, the air that choked him in his sleep. You may think I was working some kind of voodoo. Maybe I was, maybe I wasn't. But I know this. When a man builds his life on the broken backs of others, the bones remember, the walls remember, and when the reckoning comes, it doesn't always knock. One night, as I was returning from the space beneath the floorboards, I nearly walked into Joseph, one of the stable hands. He had a look in his eye. Not fear, not anger, but understanding. He didn't ask what I was doing, just nodded once and walked away. The silence of that moment told me more than words ever could. He knew and he approved. I began to sense a shift among the other slaves, too. Where there had once been distance, now there was quiet alignment. They noticed how Martha no longer barked orders with the same fury, how the master's voice barely reached across the porch, how his absence during the daily walk through the fields had become the new normal. Then came the storm. It was one of those southern storms that seemed to rise up from the soil instead of falling from the sky. The wind howled like a mother in mourning, and lightning split the sky into veins. The house shook, shutters clattering against the walls, and everyone huddled where they could find safety. Except me. I stood in the library alone, the candles flickering as rain slammed the windows. I felt it in my chest, that the storm outside was answering the storm I'd stirred inside these walls. And right then, a gust of wind slammed the library door open. Papers flew, a ledger fell off the shelf, and from behind the hearth I heard something crack. I moved quickly, opening the panel to the crawl space one last time. My charms were gone, burned to ash as I had planned. All that remained was the smell, an earthy, metallic mix of soil and blood and something else. I whispered one final sentence. Not a curse, not a prayer, just the truth. Let no name built on broken bones ever sleep easy. That night the master's heart finally gave out. They found him slumped in his chair, mouth open as if he had tried to speak one last word but couldn't remember how. They buried him the next morning. Quietly, no fanfare, no hymns, just a pine box and some muttered lines about God's will. Martha didn't cry, she didn't even flinch. She simply stared at the casket, then at me, and I stared right back. Because now came the next chapter, and I had work to do. They say revenge burns hot, but mine simmered like a slow-cooked stew, years in the making, bitter to the last drop. After Josiah's death, I wasn't left with grief. I was left with silence. No one questioned how the fire began. No one dared ask why a seasoned cook would forget something in the oven. The only thing louder than the flames had been his screams, and now even those were buried with the ashes. But that wasn't the end. I wasn't after vengeance alone. I wanted security, not just for me, but for my girls. And the others like me, still shackled by invisible chains, long after the physical ones were broken. Josiah's widow, Miss Eleanor, wore her grief like pearls, polished, performative, and suffocating. She knew her place, and with her husband gone, she intended to climb even higher. Within a week, she had the house scrubbed of smoke and sorrow, as if her son's death was a stain that could be bleached from memory. But what she couldn't clean was her reputation. Whispers trailed her like perfume, of madness, of guilt, of a curse. Some said the land was bad, some blamed the weather. Others looked to me, and I let them. See, grief can cloud a woman's mind, but suspicion makes her sharp. Eleanor started watching me differently. She no longer asked for my opinion on menus or household matters. She spoke only when needed, her eyes calculating, cautious. I became a shadow again, but this time by design. Let her feel the chill when I passed. Let her wonder if my silence held secrets. But silence is not idleness. While Eleanor rebuilt her image, I was building something else. A network. Other servants, freed women, laundresses, stable boys. People who had seen what I had seen, who had lived with the quiet violence of obedience. I traded recipes for rumors, spices for secrets. In a world where truth was dangerous, we became fluent in coded glances and half-finished sentences. We understood one another in the pauses, and then came the inheritance. Josiah's death had left Eleanor in control of the estate, land, assets, staff, but she had debts too. The family was land-rich and coin-poor, and she, with her vanity and taste for power, needed a new alliance, a marriage, to a man I knew too well. Judge Farrow was older, twice widowed, and as cruel in court as he was in private. He had owned my sister once, back when we were children. Sold her off like she was a bolt of fabric. I hadn't seen her since. Now, he was being courted by Eleanor over dinners I was expected to prepare. It made my skin crawl to feed him, to see his dry, wrinkled fingers tap the table, waiting for another pour. I watched him through the steam of the pots, and he never looked at me twice. That's how they were. If you were beneath them once, you remained invisible forever. But I was not the same girl, and I had no intention of watching another monster rise. That night after the judge left, reeking of bourbon and pride, Eleanor found me in the pantry. She was drunk on wine and desperation. "You served him venison, didn't you?" she slurred. "The man has gout." She laughed bitterly and slumped against the doorframe. "You're smarter than you look." I said nothing, simply cleaned the knife I'd used to slice the roast. She kept talking. "You know, they think I killed Josiah," she whispered. "The neighbors, my cousin, maybe even his father. You know what I say to that?" She leaned in, eyes glassy. "Good, he was weak." She left me standing there, breath tight in my chest. It was then I realized. Eleanor wasn't just cold. She was calculating. She hadn't mourned her son. She had used his death as leverage. Sympathy bought her time. Control bought her protection. And the judge, he was just a tool. But so was I. And I had no intention of being used again. The next week I poisoned her wine. Not to kill, just to make her sick. A fever, dizziness. Enough to keep her in bed while I arranged things. With her out of the way, I visited the judge's estate. Posed as a messenger. He didn't recognize me. I slipped a letter into his hands, from Eleanor, suggesting a secret wedding, an elopement to avoid scandal. He liked that. Ego is always a poison's best friend. The night of the supposed wedding, he arrived dressed in black, expecting a carriage and a trembling bride. He got me instead. Me and 3 other women, each with a reason to hate him. We didn't kill him. We didn't have to. We tied him to a chair and let him read aloud every name he had sentenced, every person he had whipped, every child he had orphaned with the stroke of his pen. We made him speak them all. Then we left him. By morning, the rumors spread. The judge had lost his mind. He was found wandering barefoot through the market, muttering names, eyes wide with ghosts. He was ruined. Eleanor never spoke of marriage again. She recovered from her illness, but her appetite had changed. She moved through the house with caution, as if the walls themselves had turned against her. I remained, the quiet cook, the invisible woman, but in that silence I had reshaped the world around me. Not with fire, not with poison, but with patience. And now I was ready for the final move. I remember the attic above the kitchen. Not because of what it was, but what it became. A place of whispers, of warnings, a place where secrets curled in the corners like smoke. The master's daughter, Miss Evelyn, used to sit there as a girl, watching the plantation from its small window. But by the time I found myself up there, it was no place for children. It was the one place left untouched by the overseer's keys. Perhaps they thought it too high, too hot, or too humble for hiding. That attic became my sanctuary, a place where I could think freely, away from eyes and orders. I'd steal minutes, never more, each time I fetched dry herbs from storage, or fetched cloth for repairs. And in those minutes I plotted not in anger, but with a chilling sort of calm, the kind that only comes after you've cried every tear you have. I knew I needed more than a plan. I needed to be invisible, necessary and clever all at once. There was one man who noticed my comings and goings, an old slave named Jeremiah. His beard was like Spanish moss, and his voice had the weight of 3 lifetimes. He never asked questions, but one day, as I passed him with a bundle of dried yarrow tucked into my apron, he looked me square in the eye and said, "Make sure whatever you do, you finish it." He didn't smile. He didn't frown. He just nodded once and went back to work. That night I couldn't sleep. His words kept echoing. Finish it. There was no turning back once I started. I would either free myself or die trying. And then a storm rolled in. It was a cruel and unusual one for spring. Thunder cracked like gunfire, and rain battered the rooftop like fists. The attic groaned. The house itself seemed to lean into the wind. I knew the family would be downstairs near the fire, huddled in safety, and I was in the attic, hidden with more than herbs in my bundle. That storm gave me a gift, noise. Noise to cover the creak of floorboards, noise to mask the clinking of glass, noise to bury the scrape of metal on stone. No one heard me move. I placed the small jar on the beam above the hearth. It looked like oil, nothing more, but its contents was something I'd spent months preparing. A mix of dried roots, sulfur, and spirits brewed so long they turned the color of old blood. Not poison, not quite, just suggestion. Enough to make those who breathed it in see things that weren't there. Enough to make their minds twist on themselves. I'd tested it before on a rat. It scratched its own eyes out. This was not murder, not directly. This was the undoing of the mind. Madness, slow and spiraling. A reflection of the torment they inflicted upon me and others, daily, gleefully, without end. I didn't want them dead. I wanted them to feel what we felt. And the attic, it would hold the scent in. Let it drift down slowly. Let it seed itself into the wood, into the air, into their dreams. The next morning I played my part. Biscuits on the tray, syrup warmed. I even smiled when Miss Evelyn complimented my jam. But by evening, the changes had begun. The master spoke to a shadow in the corner, asking it questions. His wife screamed at her own reflection, then tried to break every mirror in the house. Miss Evelyn, poor thing, she laughed until she choked. None of it pointed back to me. I remained the cook, the quiet one, the helpful one, the shadow in the background, just like I'd trained myself to be, but I was no longer silent inside. Each cry, each broken plate, each maddened ramble that echoed through the halls, each one felt like a stitch unraveling in a long-held pain I'd sewn shut for too long. I still tended their meals, still served them tea, still obeyed orders, though fewer came now. They grew afraid of sound, of light, of one another. I watched the house that once ruled over us fall in slow, crumbling madness, and no one suspected the cook, but I feared Jeremiah was right. Finish it, because madness can stop, or it can spread. It can turn back on you if you're not careful. So I waited, I watched, until one night, the master, wild-eyed and whispering to a portrait, took his hunting rifle and fired it through the ceiling, shot straight into the attic where he believed the devil himself was hiding. And the fire started. The dry rafters, the storm-damaged beams. All it took was one misfire. Flames consumed the house like a long-awaited reckoning. I ran outside with the others, acting the part of the panicked servant. Screams tore through the night. I heard Miss Evelyn sobbing near the trees. The overseer stumbled out, covered in soot, yelling for the master, who never made it out. No one could explain it. No one ever found the jar, and no one ever asked me. The house burned down to its bones, and in its ashes something else rose. Not freedom, not quite yet, but fear among them, in their minds. That was the beginning of the end for their rule over us. And I finally felt clean. You'd think that by then I'd be free of it all, that the ghosts would let me be. But the thing about burning down a house like mine, its ashes linger in your soul. Even as my hands built a new life, my mind still wandered those cracked halls and blood-soaked floorboards. After the fire, after the fall of the household that once owned every part of me, I didn't vanish into legend. I became a woman with quiet intentions. The North welcomed me, yes, but not without suspicion. The freedom up there was brittle, and every act of survival had to be rehearsed. I changed my name once again, kept it close to my chest, just like I'd done with my pain. With what little I had salvaged, tools, scraps of gold, a half-burned Bible, I built a life. No longer in shadows, but not in celebration either. I took work cleaning homes. Scrubbing away other people's dirt gave me time to think. It was strange how easily I could erase their mess, but not my own. Still, word of what I'd done traveled quietly among those who'd suffered too long. They didn't say my name out loud, but they spoke of me. That woman who burned the devil's bed while he slept, that mother who said enough and meant it. It made me uneasy. I wasn't trying to become a symbol. I was just trying to breathe. One winter, I was sweeping snow from a church's steps when a woman approached me. Her face was familiar, not from my past, but from the stories. She was a teacher, formerly enslaved like me, now helping others learn to read. She looked me in the eye and said, "You're the one, aren't you?" I didn't answer. I didn't need to. She placed a book in my hands, Wheatley's poems, and whispered, "Even fire becomes ink when it burns through silence." I began to write after that, not for anyone else, just for me. Lessons. Names I couldn't forget. Names I wasn't ready to forgive. Each page was a little less heavy than the last. I never called it healing, but it was something close. I never remarried. I couldn't. Love felt like a door I couldn't knock on again. But I raised my son with the kind of honesty I never got. He knew the truth. Not just the clean parts, but the pain, the fury, the fire. I told him not to carry it as a weapon, but as a reminder. You come from resistance, I'd say. Let that make you kind, not cruel. Years later, when he stood tall in his own home, with his own children I visited, his daughter, my grandchild, ran to me, her arms full of daffodils. "Mama Ruth," she called me. I smiled, though my name wasn't Ruth, but it was the name I'd taken when I shed my past. A name no one had power over but me. As I watched them play in a yard I'd never imagined for myself, safe, joyous Ho. I knew the story hadn't ended in flames. It had begun there. Still, there were days when I'd wake from sleep and think I heard that cursed bell or the clink of chains down the hallway, but then the sun would break through the window, and I'd remind myself I wasn't there anymore. That house was ash. That man was ash. But I was alive, and I had outlived it all. And in that, there was a kind of victory I never dared to dream. I never imagined I'd step foot on that land again, not after everything it had taken from me. But here I was, years later, standing at the edge of the same scorched field that once held the bones of my past. The breeze was softer now. The air no longer stank of smoke or screams. Yet every step I took across the soil felt like walking into a memory I never meant to revisit. I had been free for nearly 5 years, built a life in the northern hills where nobody knew my name or the blood on my hand. I cooked for strangers, stitched for children, even smiled at market men who tipped their hats politely. But deep down, I knew I'd never be truly at peace until I returned here, to the place it all began, to see what remained. The old house had collapsed in on itself, eaten by vines and time. I walked past the remains of the front porch where the master's boots once stomped, past the kitchen where I stirred soup with hate in my heart, past the stable where they took him, my son, the day he turned 12, claiming he was strong enough to be sold. My fingers brushed the splintered wood of the barn door. It swung open with a creak like a voice from the past. Inside, I saw the outlines of rusted tools, forgotten crates, and the dusty corner where I used to hide food for the runaways. The silence inside was thick, sacred even. This wasn't just a ruin. It was a graveyard of lives swallowed by one man's hunger for power. I sat there for hours, maybe longer. Let the shadows shift around me until night swallowed the land. I didn't cry. I had run out of tears long ago. Instead, I lit a small fire, just like I used to when we huddled around it at night, telling stories to forget our chains. But tonight I wasn't hiding. I wasn't a slave. I was a witness, a survivor. That's when I heard it, the crunch of footsteps in the brush. My body stiffened. I reached for the small blade I always kept in my boot, even though my hands trembled more with age now. The figure stepped into the firelight, and my heart nearly stopped. It was him, Elias, older, leaner, with streaks of silver in his beard. But those eyes, those same wide, knowing eyes he had as a child, they hadn't changed. Neither had the scar above his left brow, the one he got from falling out of a tree while picking apples we weren't allowed to touch. "Ma," he said, voice cracking like dry wood. I couldn't speak. My blade dropped to the floor. He walked forward slowly, unsure, as if the years had made me a ghost he wasn't ready to face. But I wasn't a ghost. I was his mother. And I crossed that fire pit in 2 strides and wrapped my arms around him like the world was ending. He sobbed into my shoulder, said my name over and over like a prayer. Told me he thought I was dead, that he'd heard rumors. Whispers of a woman who poisoned her master and vanished. But he never dared to believe it was me, until he did. He had made his way north, too, found work with a blacksmith, learned to read and write. But no matter how far he traveled, he said, "I never stopped dreaming about you, about that night, about the taste of stew that saved our lives. We stayed up all night trading stories, me of fire and freedom, him of hunger and hope." I learned he had a daughter now, named Ruth after me, that she laughed like I used to and danced in the rain because he told her it made her brave. I didn't tell him about the dark years, the hiding, the fear that clung to me like a second skin. He didn't need to know. All that mattered was this moment. We were whole again. Before dawn, we buried a small bundle of flowers at the edge of the field, for the ones who didn't make it, for the mothers who never got their sons back, for the children who died nameless, and the women who fought without glory. The ground accepted the offering quietly. No wind, no birdsong, just peace. Elias helped me up from the soil, and I looked at him, really looked. He was taller than me now, stronger, but still the same boy who once whispered bedtime tales while I braided his hair. My fingers touched his cheek, and he leaned into it, eyes closed. "You saved me," he said. I shook my head. "You saved me too." As the sun rose, we left the ruins behind. Walked down the same road I once ran barefoot in the dark, clutching a bottle laced with bitter root. But this time, I wasn't running. I was walking home. And if you've listened this far, maybe you understand why I'm telling you this now. Not for pity, not for praise, but for memory. So we don't forget the silent wars fought in kitchens and fields. So we honor the strength of women like me. Women who had nothing, yet gave everything for love, for justice, for freedom. I stood in the orchard where it all began, though the trees were no longer twisted, nor the sky so heavy. Years had passed since that fire changed everything, and the house that once towered over the fields had crumbled into quiet ruins. Nature had reclaimed it. Ivy twisted over the charred stones, and wildflowers bloomed where blood and secrets had once soaked the soil. They say time heals, but it doesn't erase. It only teaches you how to carry the weight without breaking under it. I had built a small cottage on the far end of the property, near the stream where the children used to chase frogs and laugh like they'd never known sorrow. It was quiet here, peaceful, but the silence wasn't empty anymore. It was full of voices I remembered, full of the past I had survived. Most people didn't know what happened the night the plantation burned. They spoke in whispers, trading theories like gossip. Lightning strike, kitchen fire, a scorned spirit come to collect old debts. No one ever guessed the truth. And those who might have had an inkling, well, they never dared to say it out loud, because deep down everyone knew some evils go too deep for justice to find. But I didn't wait on justice, I became it. After that night, I disappeared. The papers listed the family as lost in a tragic fire, with no mention of the woman who'd served them tea or cooked their feasts. I was a ghost in their story, but I was alive and free. And that was enough. Also, I thought, for years I wandered, first north, then west. I found work in places that didn't ask questions. A bakery in Nashville, a laundry in St. Louis, a cafe in New Orleans. I changed names like clothes, each one shedding more of the woman I had once been. But inside I was still Ruth. I was still the mother who'd watched her daughter be groomed for ruin. I was still the cook who'd stirred more than broth in her final pot. I was still the woman who chose vengeance when mercy would have been madness. I never looked back. Not until the letter came. It was handwritten, faded, and addressed to no one. But I recognized the script instantly. Sarah had found me. She was living in Ohio, working as a midwife and raising a son of her own. The letter didn't ask for forgiveness. It didn't offer it either. It simply said, I know what you did. I know why. And I want you to meet your grandson. That's when the ache returned. Not the pain of loss, but the hope of something new. When I saw her again, I wept. Not because she had changed, but because she hadn't. She still had that fierce, knowing look in her eyes. She still stood like someone who'd lived through fire and refused to be ash. She embraced me like no time had passed, and I held her like she was the only thing left in the world that mattered. Her son, my grandson, was a boy of 10 with curious eyes and a laugh that melted walls. When he looked up at me and called me Nana, something broke open inside me. Something I hadn't even known was locked away. I stayed. We built a life that didn't need apologies or explanations. We planted gardens together, told stories under starlight. And every Easter we lit a candle, not to mourn, but to remember. Not to curse, but to bless. Because while my story was born in bondage and soaked in silence, hers was blooming in freedom. And that was the miracle. That was the reward. One day he asked me why we never visited the place from the old stories. He meant the plantation. I didn't answer right away. But weeks later I took them both there. That's how I found myself in that orchard again, standing where a house once stood, surrounded by green things that had no business growing in such cursed soil, yet they grew. I took a spade, dug a small hole near the edge of the clearing, and planted a seedling, an apple tree, like the ones they used to force us to harvest. But this one was ours, planted not in service but in defiance. Why here, my grandson asked. Because, I said, sometimes the best revenge is leaving beauty where they tried to leave ruin. He didn't fully understand, but one day he would. And when he did, I hoped he'd tell the story. Not just of what I did, but why I did it. I hoped he'd say her name, Ruth, and not as a servant or a sinner, but as a woman who fought back when silence was no longer an option. So now, if you've come with me this far, if you followed the pain, the fear, the fire, I ask one thing. Don't just remember my name, remember why I did what I did. Because behind every quiet woman in history is a story they tried to bury, a story of love turned weapon, of mothers who became monsters so their daughters wouldn't have to. My name was Ruth. I cooked for the people who caged me. I served the ones who planned to destroy my child. And when the time came, I served them one final feast. Not out of hate, but out of hope that one day, no daughter would ever need saving like that again. Let them say what they will about the fire. Let them call it rage or madness or sin. But know this, what I left behind wasn't ashes. It was seeds,